So now we're moving into a different paced and different kind of session, what we call lightning talks, and it's a chance to hear from several individuals about critical issues affecting our work as investigative journalists. And this year, our planning committee wanted to shine a light on the increased safety risks and harassment faced by journalists in the field and online, and in particular, female journalists. To moderate this hour, it's my pleasure to introduce Krista Scharfenberg, the CEO of the Center for Investigative Reporting, which in addition to its Peabody and DuPont Awards, two Peabody Awards, one DuPont, also won the Selden Ring Award for Investigative Reporting. So, Krista.
Thanks, everybody. I was one of the people that suggested we do this session because I kind of go to bed every night and wake up every morning worried about whether we're adequately protecting the journalists who work at CIR. So I was going to talk about that a little bit, and then we have three speakers. They're each going to have about 10 minutes to talk and a few minutes for Q&A, which I will try to moderate so we move right through all three. So all of us in this room are acutely aware of the increasing threats facing journalists in recent years. It's come up in every conversation we've had today. From newsroom shootings to physical threats to online harassment and doxing to villainization of the profession itself and attempts to take down entire newsrooms through litigation. Defending ourselves against this ever-expanding set of threats is becoming more and more of an exorbitant cost of doing business. Even assessing the threats that we face across our newsroom and understanding where the weaknesses are and what we need to do to address them is an expensive undertaking. And my fear is that increasingly only the largest news organizations can adequately protect themselves. And so many of us, local news organizations, regional, nonprofits like my own, let alone freelancers, often have no choice except to be reactive, to respond when issues come up, and to address them piecemeal. Just in the last few years at CIR, we've had female journalists sexually threatened and close to harassed in the field by sources. We've had multiple reporters threatened online, including with rape and death. They've had their publication of their home addresses and other personal family information put out on the internet. We had an armed security officer stationed in our office for weeks, which felt like we needed to do it, but it didn't feel good to have him sitting there. And 2.5 years ago, we were sued by a deep-pocketed target of one of our investigations. And as Lowell said this morning, it was for simply doing our job. And Vicki, who's our general counsel and the final speaker, is going to talk more about that. So we've been able to fight these threats with the help from our peers. Many of you in this room have helped give me advice and guidance. We've had help from digital security experts, the DART Center, Trollbusters, pro bono lawyers, some of whom are also in the room, and a few of our funders who've really stepped up. But I worry every day about the threats that we're missing. So we can assess our online safety, we can assess our physical security, we can build a whole team of lawyers to protect us, but what are we not thinking about? So in our lightning talks today, our three speakers are going to share their experiences and share some real sort of tips, really, and advice for how to think about these issues. But as we listen to them, I hope we can all think about how, together, to build a much stronger safety net for the work that we do, and to help organizations really look holistically at our security in every sense of the word as we move forward doing this work. So we're moving from a personal story in one news outlet to a broader look at safety and security for journalists. Elisa Liz Munoz is Executive Director of the International Women's Media Foundation. She leads the organization in supporting women journalists as they develop their careers by providing training, tools, and assistance so they can work as safely as possible. She's charged with growing the IWMF by expanding its programs into new geographies, introducing new initiatives such as the hostile environments and first aid training, which she's going to talk about, partnering with other organizations and driving communications and outreach to core constituencies. So welcome, Elisa.
Thank you. Well, I think I'm preaching to the choir a little bit here, but I know that we all agree that it matters who tells the news and who decides what the news is. And at the IWMF, we focus on advancing women in the news media globally and on breaking the barriers that keep them out. We offer grants and fellowship opportunities to staff and freelance women journalists or teams of journalists who are led by women, and I encourage you all to look at those opportunities. We believe that the press can truly only be free with the equal voice of women. And in the past 16 years, female representation in the news media has grown less than 1%. We know that women far outnumber men in journalism schools and journalism graduate programs, and exactly when they leave or fall off the industry hasn't been adequately studied, but we do have some ideas. Women struggle to break into the profession and to move into leadership positions. We continue to be horrified by how common sexual harassment is at every level of the media business, and online harassment is driving journalists out of the profession, particularly younger women journalists. We know that diversity makes good business sense, and there's ample research to show that. Organizations with more diversity, and especially diversity at the top, are more successful. And our grants and reporting opportunities have provided byline opportunities to hundreds of women journalists. So why does this matter? According to the most recently accessible statistics from the Global Media Monitoring Project, only 28% of all news stories published quote even one woman. And in general, only 10% of the stories published focus on women or women's issues. You actually all can do something about this, and I am always an advocate of counting. You can count daily, you can count weekly, you can count monthly. Who are you quoting and who are your experts? We're all subject to our own unconscious biases, and we need to guard against those by holding ourselves accountable. Additional reasons for supporting female journalists around the world is that there are many places where women are just not, where women have the access. Courage in Photojournalism Award winner Andrea Bruce told me that her most impactful photograph was a photograph of the burial of a toddler, and she was only able to get into that place where this was happening because she was a woman. Amy Ferris Rodman was reporting in Afghanistan, and she told me that in all of the bureaus, all of the foreign bureaus in Afghanistan during the time that she was there, which was about 5 years, there was not one local Afghani woman journalist hired. And there were female Afghani journalists, but the Afghani men did not want to work with them. So imagine what that means about the stories that we were reading about women in Afghanistan. Adrienne Ohanessian, who is also a Courage in Photojournalism Award winner, told us that where she often reports from in South Sudan, she sometimes has to go through 7 men to be able to speak to one woman. And she does that. She takes the time to do it. So that's really important. There are a lot of forces out there trying to shut women up. We know that. Physical attacks and online attacks threaten a free press. These attacks silence voices. They exacerbate the lack of diversity in the news media. They lead to stories being untold, and they further engender a lack of trust in the news media. And online attacks are actually more ubiquitous. The IWMF conducted a survey to assess the impact of online harassment on female journalists and their reporting. And of the 600 respondents, 52% of the respondents said that they've experienced an offense within the past year. 70% of the women experienced more than one type of harassment, threat, or attack. And 3/10 considered leaving the profession altogether as a result of that experience. The attacks are gendered, they're designated to shame. The comments are about appearance, intellectual rigor, and professional credentials, and they're meant to undermine women journalists. And the emotional impact is real. People who are constantly attacked online exhibit symptoms of PTSD. So I don't think that we should underestimate the real importance of paying attention to these attacks. The IWMF is also addressing physical threats that exist in the field, and women journalists face unique threats. We've developed hostile environments training courses that are geared towards women. In 2018 alone, we provided 11 hostile environments and first aid training courses to 166 international journalists in Africa, Latin America, Bangkok, and Lebanon. And this year, we're going to start offering HEFAT courses in the U.S. I believe that most of you work for media organizations, but I'd be really curious to see how many of you have gone through hostile environments training. Yeah, not that many, it looks like to me. So we really hope that this kind of training that we'll be making available for free and working with local media organizations around the country will make that opportunity more available to journalists in the U.S. So I was asked to offer a few tips about how to address harassment and attacks, and I am not a security expert, but we have worked closely with many. We launched a program a couple of weeks ago to offer support to journalists who are experiencing online harassment. And there are some specific actions that can be taken by newsrooms in particular. What our expert told us is that for newsroom leaders, the message is clear. You have to create a culture where reporters feel safe to report the attacks. For journalists experiencing the attacks, it can feel overwhelming, and you need to know where to go. Media organizations, no matter how small, need to adopt a holistic approach that addresses both online and offline threats. In many organizations, these are considered very differently by different people, and often it's the tech guy who's being told about the online attack, and that's really not helpful. And digital attacks should be taken seriously. Twitter death threats are serious threats, and they should be taken seriously. Jason Reich, who's the Vice President of Security for the New York Times, has been a leading voice on building resilience for media organizations to deal with digital attacks, and he advocates for newsrooms implementing policies that allow their journalists to separate their social media, their private social media, and their public social media, and he actually walks journalists through making that happen. He also recommends that newsrooms develop a threat assessment process that includes online threats, especially looking at when they have the propensity or the potential to turn into physical threats. He describes the importance of peer support. He really thinks that it's critical that people be able to go to their peers, sometimes to have them just take over their social media accounts so that they're not the ones reading the attacks, and really being the ones who for a few days point out the most heinous threats to digital security experts. We hope that our program that is meant to build an ecosystem of support for journalists around the world will help journalists get that support on a one-on-one basis. Especially with digital security, it's really difficult to go through a manual and reset your settings and really figure out what to do. So we want to put journalists in direct contact with digital security experts around the country and around the world, and that's what our program is going to be focusing on. I did get 10 tips from our Courage in Journalism Award winner, Catherine Guchuru, who founded an organization called Code for Africa. And some of these are very basic things that I hope some of you have already done, but obviously Google yourself, see what kind of information is out there. Get a cover for your camera screen. Switch off all of the locations on your apps. Install two-factor authentication on all your devices. Encrypt communications and file sharing. Use social media precautions, but more importantly, also tell your family to use social media precautions. Don't take a photograph in front of your house. Don't take a photograph in front of your parents' house, etc. Use anonymizing services. Use a VPN. Get digital security assessments of where you're going to report from if you are traveling abroad. And learn how to identify phishing exercises. We also, in terms of physical security, we want to show you exactly what our HEFAT training sometimes looks like. And we designed these based on the region where we're going to be taking reporters, and they're very focused on very specific threats that the reporters will face where they're going. So they're all different.
Go, go! Get out! Stop! Stop!
My hands were zip tied, I was blindfolded. And then they took me up this hill and had me kneel.
Es que lee, ¿ok? ¿Oíste?
I was doing a training in Mexico when we got kidnapped by the cartel Los Zetas Comando Zetas on my way out of our hotel. They want $10,000 US in a wire transfer to one of our accounts.
The message was so graphic, and I just thought about my family. It was just terrifying.
Take 2 deep breaths, yeah. Try and calm yourself down. And while you're taking those 2 deep breaths, just think, okay, what have I got here?
Body weight!
Stronger!
Erica?
Yes!
Seeing fellow women like kick ass quite literally during the self-defense and hearing them cheer you on and all of that is amazing.
Stop, stop.
Here we go.
Oh, and you just keep pushing it that way.
What you're doing, you're trying to pick, lock something here.
Let's go. 10 seconds.
Okay.
You got this. You got this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Venga conmigo. Camina.
So as you can see, these courses are pretty realistic, and we have heard back from some of our fellow journalists who have participated who have unfortunately had to use this kind of training. There's one story in particular from our Courage in Photojournalism Award winner, Adrian, who was in the DRC when a camp that she had stopped in was attacked by some militants. She ran off. The people she was working with from, I believe it was a Danish media organization, ran off in a different direction. She ended up jumping into abandoned mine and had to sit there for 23 hours until she was sure that the militants had left. And she told us when she got out that the training really kicked in and that she could see our trainer, Jean-Francois, in her head telling her what to do. And it's really meant to give you a sense of what your own reaction would be and to give you just a few tips that hopefully will keep you alive. So I hope that with our training and with other training that's available through other organizations, that most journalists in this country will have had the experience of going through this kind of important training, addressing the issues that they will face. Just a couple more resources. The IWMF is part of the Journalists in Distress Network, and I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's a coalition of organizations that support journalists in the most dangerous of times, provide funding for relocation, for legal support, for trauma support. At one point last year, we were getting one request every 72 hours for this kind of support. So it is out there. There's not enough support. There's not enough money to provide for all of the cases that we receive. There are also organizations like a Culture of Safety Alliance that is also an alliance of media development organizations and also media organizations, the New York Times, The Guardian, AFP, many of them are part of this alliance, really to spread this culture of safety and to offer these kinds of services whenever possible. So for example, if The Guardian is doing HEFAT training and they have a couple of spaces open, they let everybody know so that we can get as many people through them as possible. And then lastly, there are a lot of resources that are available online, and I encourage you to go to the GIJN network, the Global Investigative Journalist Network, where these appear, and use them. There are instructions about how to do security protocols, how to do security assessments, and all of those kinds of things that I hope that you all take advantage of. Thank you.
We have time for one question. Laura?
Laura Seidel would have heard me on NPR, perhaps. I've also taught here at the journalism school. And I have dealt with harassment on Twitter, and of course I report on Twitter, and something that dawned on me as you were talking is, has there ever been a consortium of journalism organizations coming together as to talk to Twitter? Because a lot of this harassment, not just in this country, but I've talked to Mexican journalists, it's really reached epic levels at various points in Mexico, that there is some way as a more unified force to talk to Twitter about what's going on. They're hard to deal with. I mean, this I know, but I do wonder about that.
Yeah. To my knowledge, a group of media organizations have not gone to Twitter. I know that there are many, CPJ is really addressing and going to Twitter. It's really, the response is extremely appalling. I don't know if you've reported an offense and you get the message back. Even the response is traumatizing. It basically tells you that you're crazy, it's not that big a deal, and they haven't broken any of our protocols, so go away. When we're at media organization meetings like this, and there's a Twitter representative who's a very lovely person who basically gives out his card to every journalist and says, call me. And my feeling is that's your response to the global problem of online harassment, is to give out your card. It's inadequate. A lot of people, including the IWMF, feel that they don't really want to address this problem. They address problems when there are high visibility journalists like Rana Ayub or Teresa Ressa, and then they get on it, but hundreds and hundreds of thousands of journalists are facing this kind of abuse, and they're not on it. So I encourage media organizations to get together to address Twitter and take them on and hold them accountable. It's not acceptable. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So next up is Victoria Baranetsky, who's the General Counsel at the Center for Investigative Reporting. When I read her bio, you're going to think she must be like 75 years old, but she's not. Before coming to CIR, she was the first legal fellow for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, a legal counsel at the Wikimedia Foundation, and served as the First Amendment Fellow at the New York Times. After graduating from Harvard Law School, she received a master's degree in philosophy from Oxford University and clerked for the Honorable Rosemary Pooler of the Second Circuit. She has a bachelor's degree from Columbia University and a graduate degree from Columbia Journalism School. She spent most of those years in school. She currently is a fellow at the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. She's also a wonderful human being and one of the best hires I've ever made. So.
Hello. My name is Victoria Baranetsky. I'm a free speech attorney and serve as general counsel at CIR, the oldest nonprofit newsroom in the Bay Area, based here in the Bay Area. And I'm pleased to be here to speak to you about one of the most important things that exists in our society, the legal protection of stories, and explain how they are at risk. As journalists, you all know and value the important stories, but so do attorneys. At the core of every case are the facts of what happened to the plaintiff and the defendant. The holding or the rule is the lesson that results from those set of facts. And the most moving stories are often the ones that shed light on things that otherwise would not be changed. We see this happen with canonical cases like Brown v. Board, Lawrence v. Texas, Roe v. Wade, where the holding completely shifted our thinking of society. As you all will know, in the United States, we have a variety of rights that are protected under the Constitution and Bill of Rights. The first of those rights, enumerated in the First Amendment, states Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. It is here in our Constitution where we value our stories by protecting free speech as well as you, the professional storytellers who tell them. Many scholars believe the First Amendment to be of primary importance within our Constitution, not just because it's number one, but because it serves as a check on government. But there's another deeper reason. As Justice Jackson wrote in a 1943 case, West Virginia v. Barnett, if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is the right of the First Amendment to protect us from control over our thoughts. At issue in that case was the question of whether a student could protest saluting the American flag during the Second World War. The court wrote that a student could protest because it was principally a different way of looking at the world outside of the status quo. That's the core of the First Amendment, to leave room for minority voices that can change things. In our society, journalists are the megaphones for minority voices. But no one said telling these stories makes you popular, as we've heard. In fact, the best stories often cause consternation. For example, even the esteemed Justice Brandeis wrote in a famous 1890 Harvard Law Review article that the press is overstepping in every direction the obvious bounds of propriety and decency. Gossip has become a trade which is pursued with industry as well as effrontery. The fact is, sometimes there is gossip. But sometimes there are great stories, and new ideas don't come without ruffling a few feathers. That's why nearly half a century later, another Supreme Court Justice, William Brennan, wrote in a landmark 1964 press freedom case, New York Times v. Sullivan, that the press is necessary in part because it provides a world where debate on public issues should be, quote, uninhibited, robust, and wide open. In essence, the news media works when it sparks strong reflection and discourse on issues and stories that matter in society. And if that system of story making is working well, we are living in a society of knowledge and understanding. If it is not working well, something is wrong. As philosopher Amartya Sen said, if a nation's press is unhealthy, so is its government. That's why if you look at the situation today, there is cause for concern. In particular, the increased threat of litigation against news organizations is threatening our constitutional order and government. In the 1964 Supreme Court case, previously mentioned, New York Times v. Sullivan, which heightened the standard to bring a successful defamation case by a public official. For decades following that case, reporters in the US have felt a certain freedom, that they can publish truthful information and be protected as long as they didn't report with malice. To prove actual malice under Sullivan, a plaintiff has to show that the writer knew that the disputed statement was false or had acted with, quote, reckless disregard. That standard in Sullivan, a watershed case, changing the news media into the robust institution that helped expose Watergate, Guantanamo, Snowden, and countless other stories. For 55 years, that lofty precedent that helped journalists of legend like Woodward and Bernstein, as well as freelancers in the news industry, feel confident when reporting on matters of government accountability without the fear of retribution through a vexatious libel suit. Indeed, before Sullivan, a number of defamation lawsuits against news organizations around the country was nearly $300 million, as part of a focused effort by Southern officials to use libel suits as a means of preventing critical coverage of civil rights issues. After Sullivan, the number precipitously dropped. However, today, it appears that things may be reversing course, and we may be returning to a pre-Sullivan era. Nearly a decade ago, the number of libel lawsuits against the news media institutions was meager, and usually only brought by plaintiffs who were not represented by counsel and therefore didn't know how unlikely they were to win. For example, New York Times counsel David McCraw wrote that between 2010 and 2017, the Times had 11 libel suits, all but one of them filed in the United States. This is meaningfully different from today, when the Times has several libel lawsuits on its docket. As McCraw writes, Sullivan led to a series of other court decisions that curtailed the ability of libel plaintiffs to win their lawsuits. None of it was intended to be balancing. It was an imbalancing, a conscious decision by the courts to free journalists to pursue the truth without fear of triggering a lawsuit that could bankrupt their publisher. The Sullivan decision, like the First Amendment itself, was anchored in the belief that competing voices, rather than lawsuits, were the best way to get at truth. So what happened from the time of Sullivan until now? In 2012, the news media, legally speaking, hit a huge inflection point. Many of you will well remember the tale of Balea v. Gawker. As you likely recall, in that case, Peter Thiel, a wealthy Silicon Valley billionaire, funded a costly litigation brought by Hulk Hogan, or Terry Balea, as a vendetta against the news outlet for doxing him. The lawsuit ultimately put the newsroom out of business by forcing it into bankruptcy. In essence, Gawker couldn't afford to defend itself against the lawsuit, even where the alleged claims had no legs. As fewer people might know, the federal district court that remanded the case back down to the state court repeatedly said plaintiff had no tenable legal argument under privacy or libel, noting protections under the First Amendment and Hogan's public persona. In fact, as any media attorney would have told you, if Gawker had had its full day in court and was able to appeal, it would have won. Unfortunately, Gawker folded because it couldn't foot the bill of litigation. While the law of the First Amendment and New York Times v. Sullivan is still good law, as explained by the federal district judge, what various wealthy and elite took away from Gawker was not the state of the law, but that the judicial system could be used to wear down a news institution through expensive litigation. Since that case, many other wealthy members in our society have followed this blueprint, bringing frivolous but costly defamation lawsuits against the Times, BuzzFeed, Washington Post, Mother Jones, the Center for Investigative Reporting, just to name a few. After Gawker, Brian Knappenberger made a documentary, Nobody Speaks, noticing this pattern. Knappenberger noticed, quote, an ugly theme of billionaires involved in media bringing lawsuits or tearing down the press. Working for a newsroom that's facing one of these battles, I can concretely state that the price of litigation is no small feat and deeply concerning. As the news industry is facing unprecedented shifts in our business model, having lost advertising as the main source of income, defending such suits is a Goliath task. Even with insurance, the costs can be insurmountable. In part, these costs are due to the massive technological changes in society that have expanded a journalist's footprint to the size of Bigfoot's big ugly cousin. Years ago, in a defamation lawsuit brought against a newspaper, there would be a limited amount of information, a handful of notepads, documents, tape recordings. But today, we have discovery that can surface millions of records from emails, apps, chats, digital tape recordings, tweets, Facebook messages, troves of leaked documents. For instance, in CIR's own libel lawsuit, which involved one episode of our podcast called Reveal, reporters went out into the field in the early morning, would turn on the digital tape recorder, and wouldn't shut it off until the rest of the day. This is normal course today. They did this for days. So discovery required us to listen to hours of tapes to accurately respond to discovery requests. That doesn't even begin to account for a fraction of the records involved in litigation, including the leaked records, emails, chats, Google Calendar invitations, and all else. To go through this type of discovery, you have to have a bank account that's not just plump, but overflowing. We at CIR, a nonprofit investigative newsroom with a budget of $11 million, were not looking good. In fact, until this past fall, I, my CEO, and outside counsel were seriously concerned about the future of our newsroom. Luckily, we were able to secure pro bono counsel offered from Covington and Davis Wright Tremaine, without which future of CIR, the oldest nonprofit newsroom in the country, would have been more than uncertain. It would have been deadly. And with that end would not only have gone 40 years of legacy of investigative reporting, but countless stories about people, injustices, and tales about Americans. but other newsrooms are not as lucky. Just this past year, lawyers for Covington Catholic High School student filed a $275 million defamation suit against CNN. The Washington Post was sued by the same family for $250 million. David Nunez, we heard, sued for a $150 million defamation suit. But luckily, Sullivan is still good law. Many cases still get thrown out for not meeting the Sullivan standard. Recently, the Victoria Advocate, a local Texas newspaper, won a case brought by a doctor asking for $2 million in damages. That said, in just this past year, we've seen another huge worry arise. This time is not just the cost of litigation, but the legal underpinnings itself, i.e. Sullivan. In the past few years, there have been concerns over the future of that lofty precedent is falling. As many of you know, in 2016, the president was quoted for saying, quote, I can't do the accent, so apologies. I'm going to open up our libel laws so when they write purposely negative and horrible false articles, we can sue them and win lots of money. While media attorneys quickly scoffed at these seemingly absurd statements, more recently, a U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas wrote something alarmingly similar in an opinion, saying, New York Times v. Sullivan was, quote, policy-driven decision masquerading as constitutional law. He continued, there appears to be little historical evidence suggesting that the New York Times actual malice standard flows from the original understanding of the First and 14th Amendment. So, now that I've scared you and laid out this problem, what is there left to say? Well, despite all that, believe it or not, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because of the doctrine of stare decisis states that Sullivan, a half-century-old case, is not only good law, but deeply entrenched in our history. As law professor Sonia West wrote in a 2018 article, historical evidence from the founding era shows that the framers considered press freedom to be of vital importance. James Madison declared that liberty of the press to be one of the greatest bulwarks of liberty and essential to security of freedom in a state. Adams also said that a free press maintains the majesty of a people. Working in a newsroom, you certainly see this. Things have not changed. Journalists continue to be vital, deeply resilient, and majestic. But other than resilience, there are several things reporters can do to beat the bullies. And it goes back to grade school. Do your homework. Journalists today must spell out everything in a story. For instance, Kept Out, a recent Pulitzer finalist story written by our journalists at CIR, which revealed that home loans given by banks across the country were racially disparate, was helped by us providing more detail than common. Based on a regression analysis done by our data team, our newsroom issued a white paper that delved into the specific mathematical equations that led to our shocking findings. This made all the purported claims by the banks that our findings were wrong very easy to combat because we did our homework. Additionally, it's essential that journalists keep a healthy note-taking hygiene. As I've explained to reporters in my newsroom, when documents are no longer limited to a few notebooks and a cardboard box in a newsroom, journalists are increasingly vulnerable. Today, reporters must be cognizant that everything they create on their smartphone can be searched and collected. And where records can't be taken from a newsroom, they can be subpoenaed from a third-party provider like Facebook, Google, or Twitter. So journalists should therefore keep a catalog of all the records they are creating for a story on various platforms. Reporters for Reveal are starting to do this now for all major news investigations. Dovetailing from there, don't use fighting words on the playground. While platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter are helpful to journalists, they encourage guttural responses and quick-witted remarks with likes. But do not fall prey. These likable thoughts on Twitter can easily become the subject of a lawsuit that will come back to haunt you. Ask Rolling Stone. Okay. Outside of that, what can attorneys do? Outside of reporters, what can attorneys do? First, they have to support media organizations like the Reporters Committee and the Knight Institute. Law firms should support pro bono work. Attorneys should promote anti-SLAPP legislation. And most of all, in-house counsel should never settle. As David McCraw wrote in a famous letter now, if Trump disagrees, we welcome the opportunity to have a court set him straight. which might be my last point. Never settle. Settling creates a bad precedent, and oh God, I'm just going to cut to the. We're almost done. Settling creates a bad precedent, and it basically instigates people to continue suing. I'll end with just one short note of hope. As history shows us, our country has survived similar instances of threat. In the 1790s, John Adams wrote, as was written about John Adams, in an unbounded thirst for ridiculous pomp, foolish adulation, and self-avarice, he put over 30 journalists in jail. But even then, journalists were resilient. In fact, one put in jail named Matthew Lyon ran for Congress and won. I suggest we do the same.